without further ado, let's get to the reason we're all here tonight. I'm super excited to have Aarron speaking here. His book is Designing for Emotion. I'm a big fan of his book. He is currently the VP of Design Publishing and Education at Envision. Before that, he was the head of UX design at MailChimp. Aarron, welcome. And now, thanks so much. That was a great talk, a lot of great advice, a lot of great resources. And now we can just do a little fireside chat between me and you. I'll ask some questions. I was reading the new book, and I loved one of the quotes was, designers creating interfaces that are just usable is like a chef creating food that's just edible. So I thought that's something to help non-designers maybe appreciate how usable just isn't that impressive. And you know, your previous book came out a while ago, and that point of that book was to elevate the discussion from usability to delight.
That's right.
What I'm hearing you now say is, well, that was great, but we got to go beyond delight to all emotions. So can you talk about that arc and that evolution? Because I think it's a very forward thinking. I know there are still some teams, the way I like to say it is some teams, they know they should focus on usability, but for various reasons they don't. And I feel like, you know, the top third of teams know they should focus on delight, whether they do or not is another thing. But now you're telling us that there's even a higher bar. If you could talk about that evolution, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah. I noticed that our industry often is myopic. We make some really great things, and let's be honest, like many of the things that we have made, we've worked on, and we've put into the world have changed the world, have really changed the way that we operate as humans, how we move about the world, how we learn, how we connect with each other. I mean, software is so pervasive in our lives. It's everywhere. It's in our thermostat, it's in our car, it's in education, it's in, you know, healthcare, whatever. And one thing that I feel like we need to do more is just like look to history and look to other industries and what has happened before and reflect on what we could do better. Industrial designers and you know, product designers making physical goods, architects, have seen that behavior is shaped by design. So, for example, you know, you go into a really great building and it will shape the way that you move through that space. You know, we can look at two functionally similar things like, you know, Honda Fit versus Lexus RF. These are two cars that are functionally the same, but you know, it's like a $40,000 difference between the two products. And what's the difference that causes us to spend more money? It's that emotional engagement. So that's kind of like single dimensional though to me, that, you know, bringing this product mentality to what we're making, what we're putting in the world, and finding a way for people to feel connected to that, just on a delightful level. I remember, you know, those early days at MailChimp in 2008, 9, 10, of just feeling like we can make whatever we want and it's going to be awesome and the outcomes will be really amazing. And being very excited about that recognition of like, hey, industrial designers and architects have figured this out. Why don't we figure this out and bring this on board too? But not really thinking about like all the dark sides of what we could be making. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of dark sides of what we make, and it's just so crystal clear right now that we can see that daily. And so it feels to me that there needs to be this shift. More people in the conversation, looking at problems from different directions, and thinking not so on that base level of like, let's make people smile. Some people aren't smiling. Some people, you know, sometimes things aren't going well. And some part of what we can do in design and product design is solve for those negative experiences.
Yeah, I guess one way I think about it, the evolution is just in the, you know, back in the day, the percentage of time or things you would do on web software was lower, I guess. And as software is eating the world, more and more of our, and mobile phones, like just maybe more of our life is spent on these apps, and therefore a wider range of emotions is more relevant now than just like, you know, just like a one-off kind of thing. So,
well, yeah. if design, if software was only finding its way into our life in these niche places, like, hey, I want to do this cool thing, like a little marketing thing or whatever. That's different than, you know, my kid's school is closed and now we have online learning. And I have a 10-year-old trying to learn back here on a crappy piece of software. That's a stressful situation. We can design for that. We can we can use the tools we have to create something that's good.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you shared the pyramid. You know, I think that you shared multiple examples of how even products that are kind of comparable in functionality, so like they're identical in the bottom three layers, that just having a really strong top layer of emotional design can be a super strong differentiator, assuming all the other things are pretty much at parity. And, you know, again, I was an early user at MailChimp, and I just remember how it just like was head and shoulders a better UX than the other products. I got to share the screenshot of the one thing that my favorite delight store. If I can share this real quick, share the screen, share. And this was when the email previewer, can you see it or not? Is it the wrong screen? Okay. So, right. So when you would preview it with the pixels, and as you stretched it, you saw a space start to make this space. And I remember the first time I did, I'm like, no way. I wonder what happens if they keep pulling it, you know, and his face would get more and more, and eventually his arm popped off. So, you know, it's just great. And it made me wonder, you know, there was such that differentiator at MailChimp compared to the other product was so big. It made me wonder, gosh, what is the team, how did they accomplish that? That was clearly done deliberately. You know, how did they think about their UX strategy? So I don't know if you can talk about, I know it's from before, but like how do you go about thinking about, okay, this is our UX strategy? How do you come up with that?
So I can't take credit for the arm popping off. That's Ben Chestnut, CEO, co-founder.
Oh,
that
your
was him.
CEO's coming in on it. Great.
So that is part of it, was just, you know, like if you want to make a new product, put a product into a crowded market, or define a new category. Do you want to blend in with everybody? You probably don't. At the time, there were so many competitors that sounded almost the same. Like they would start with similar letters. The look would be very similar. And I, even, you know, working at MailChimp, I would get them confused because they were so similar. So part of it was like, let's stand out and be not the same as the rest of the market. And that's the wisdom of Ben Chestnut, that he realized, like, okay, let's take a risk here. As Ralph says, break the mold a bit. And also, I think there was a lot of luck in that. Ben, when I was hired, it was me and one other engineer were hired at the same time, and they basically just gave us the keys to the kingdom and said, like, go build this product. And we tore it down and rebuilt it from scratch. And that I was picking up what Ben was putting down. I was a customer for 3 years. I really loved that customer experience. It felt like there was a human on the other side. And I loved that. That's what attracted me to the product. And I wanted to kind of extend that. And so that was in the DNA. I think that there are other companies where it's like Headspace, to go back to them, where I don't know if that's necessarily coming from the co-founders, or if it's coming from that early design team of like, here's our problem. How do we break into this category? And how do we make people feel like, okay, meditation feels inscrutable. How do I bring you into this? And so thinking about emotional design as a lever for that competitive advantage.
That's a good point. I guess it's got to come into the company's DNA somehow. So from some people, and to get into the culture, to have that awareness of that top level of that pyramid, I guess. So
that said, I think that it can come in at any time in company's history. I just saw Kevin Flores, his name float by here, who was at 23andMe, and I think that they've done a lot of really thoughtful things over there too. It's not about humor. It's about like, how do I diffuse the fear that people bring of like, wait, you're going to map my genetic code, and what are you going to do with it? And is my healthcare provider going to figure that out?
Right. Someone just mentioned Cybertruck. Cybertruck rationalized. I guess the Tesla Cybertruck thinking different. All right, cool. Well, that's the other thing about these delighters or these emotional design is I think a lot of times people don't have a lot of experience with it, assume it's got to be some big scope thing. We've got to like, it's got to be like, magical laser beams that do this thing or auto magical this or that. And you see the examples you brought up, like the high five or the pixel previewer, they don't take a lot of effort. And so I just, I don't know if you've experienced that where people trying to come up with things, view that it takes a lot of effort. Are there any hacks or tricks on how to identify these simple delighters that can really make a big difference in people?
Exposure to your customer is the way that you do it. And I used to run the research team at MailChimp, and we did a lot of research. And I would always look for like, when do the curse words come out in the customer interview? When do they get really frustrated? We did switch interviews. Those of you who were last week or the last meetup where you talked about jobs to be done, switch interviews are a methodology for talking to customers to understand why they bought or why they left your product. And that often there was a lot of emotion that was visible and like what pulled you over, like the forces that push you to the product and pull you away. So when you spend time with customers, you start to recognize like their body language changes, they're leaning in, or maybe they're leaning back. I've had interviews where people cry, they're telling something really potent. Or like I said, they drop an F-bomb and you realize like, okay, that is when it was most stressful, most frustrating. That's a valley moment. What can we do about that? How can we, and watching people use your product and get really frustrated, that's really about functionality, like that usability of like making it a little bit easier, but you can also discover some like what's going on in their head and how they're feeling.
Okay, cool. And then someone had a question here, which is also on my Fireside chat, is related to that. Imagine you find some problem and you fix it, or you add some positive emotional experience. How do you measure the impact? You mentioned measuring the impact of the line. How can you tell how much an impact that you're having on your customers? What's a good way to measure the impact and track it over time?
So it depends. And anyone that's in the product field probably knows that my metrics are going to be different than your metrics. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. You're probably familiar with things like a heart framework that came out of Google because the folks there on the research team kept getting asked the same thing, like what metrics should we track? And so they just wanted to provide a really good baseline. And then there's like pirate metrics and others, but what are you trying to achieve? Is it like a retention thing? Is it like, time to completion of a very specific task that, tends to lead to stickiness? And what can happen along that way? What's like the emotionally difficult moment? What are the apprehensions that people bring to your product of like, I've used this before and that was really great. And why should I trust you? Or the space of banking or fintech. I don't really trust it. So being aware of like the pervasive emotion that's in that space is important, which again, you find from talking to customers. So your metrics are going to be different depending on what you're trying to achieve. I will also say that there are some things like that Intuit example of just acknowledging loss. I don't think I'd assign a metric to that. That's like, what is the metric for that thing? Sure. The examples of Duolingo and Headspace and others, Wealth Simple, those are metric focused, but there are lots of places where qualitative findings are super valuable too.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that they hopefully will lead to things like improvement in retention, improvement in some of the other things. So the qualitative moments lead to that.
Yep.
So, yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. So the first edition came out, 2011, got a lot of positive feedback. Can you just, for people maybe some of the people have read the first edition, or people just want to know what's the difference, can you talk about kind of what's made differences in the second edition? It's been 9 years, I guess. So what are the main differences? What do you say?
In a nutshell, the first edition is let's design for delight. Let's surpass that bar of usable. And the 2020 edition is let's stop thinking like design for delight is falls woefully short of feeding the needs of the human spirit. Let's think about how we design products in a more broad sense of like all the emotions that people bring to products. Little backstory about writing it. It started out as like, hey, Aarron, would you like to do a second edition and just update some examples? And I spent a lot of time researching, probably like 5 months researching and writing, and came to my editor, and it was clear that, you know, writing a book and making changes, it's sort of like playing Jenga. You pull on one thing, it causes everything else to fall. And it just became really clear that it's not enough today in 2020 to just update a few examples. It's really, it's a fundamentally different world. It is a fundamentally different world today than it was in 2011 when that first edition came out. So there's a new chapter on diversity and inclusion. The last chapter about the business side of emotional design is brand new. And there's so much of everything else that has been reworked and rethought. It's a very different book.
Good. Yeah. No, let's talk about diversity inclusion some more if we could. I was really inspired by the Project Inkblot that there was very specific questions, because I think part of it is people want to do emotional design, want to be more inclusive. They don't know how to go about it. And so having practical questions and guides. Can you talk more about how people that want to focus more on diversity and inclusion can go about that?
Yeah. My friend Benjamin Evans, who's over at Airbnb, has a really simple axiom, which is, who are we not including? And so when we think about products, I love the Project Inkblot, all people statements, all people can blah. That is so powerful because it really helps you see your blind spots. So I love that one, but who are we not including is a fundamental question, and it works not just for product design, but it also could be like as you build your team, who are we not including? Who's not represented here? That's a great way to kind of identify your blind spots. Who are we not including in this meeting as we're thinking about a project? So maybe you're working on an illustration for Pride Month. Do you have someone from LGBTQ plus community who's involved in that project that can help you think about that in a very specific way? So who are we not including, I think, is just a good, simple thing. Like when we're back in physical space together, that's a great poster to have on your wall.
Got it. Yeah. And even in marketing, where you're marketing images and things like that. That's a question that everybody can ask.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So the main, going back to the second edition versus first, the main thing is expanding beyond just delight to a broader range of emotions.
Yeah.
Being kind of a framework guy, I'm wondering, is there like a list of those emotions or some kind of map of those emotions? Like how would someone, like kind of not miss one, or how should they think about that set of emotions?
Yeah. There are maps. I am totally blanking on her name. She's a professor at Stanford who did a bunch of research like in 2000. Her name is Jennifer. I'll track it down.
Sorry, I know it's late on the East Coast. Thanks for
there's a whole map. Like if you Google for emotion map, you'll find those.
Yeah.
To be honest, I haven't in my work found that particularly meaningful, because most of these emotions you're experiencing on a daily basis. And we navigate the world with recognition of emotion.
Right.
And there's certain careful considerations. There's a very big difference with how we interact with each other when we see one another's face. And I see your house and I kind of get a sense for who you are in your context versus if it's anonymous. So if we're anonymous on a platform like Twitter or Facebook or wherever, we will say and do things that we would not normally do, that we would not want our mamas and dads to see us do, right? So we know what those emotions are. We know how to treat people. And so the idea of emotional design is about that awareness and bringing that to our process.
I think it's an excellent point. I think the other point is feedback, right? When you're talking to someone, you can see their face. If you say something that bothers them, you get that feedback because their face,
Yeah.
right? Whereas if
Yeah.
a product, I feel like a product, it's tone deaf. You know, it
Right.
doesn't know.
Right.
So maybe some of this is about product being responsive to, yeah, like in the TurboTax case, it anticipated a situation,
Yeah.
and had an appropriate response for that. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of interesting. Okay. All right. What else?
Incidentally,
Oh, yeah.
TurboTax, like, or Intuit, they had this long history of a Follow Me Home program. Do you know
Right.
that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
Of just like, you're not literally following people home, but it's kind of like the intercept of like, hey, I
Yeah.
see you're using our product.
Yeah.
Can I come talk to you?
Yeah, I'm old enough that when I worked there, when it would launch, we would go to the stores and we would go and watch people. We wouldn't follow them home, but we'd watch them as they were shopping and picking up the box and looking to see what was going on. So yeah, no, I think I love the DNA. And we touched on it briefly, the design for delight kind of cultural focus of Intuit. I don't know if you have any more that you can talk about on that, or any other tips, or just to let people know kind of what that was, because Intuit went pretty big on buying into delight as a cultural kind of attribute.
Yeah. It's in their DNA from the beginning. Their founder and the various CEOs through the years have also been connected to that. In fact, there's been a lot that's written about the kind of the ups and downs of the business and its success.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at its best when they had that focus on the customer experience.
Right.
And it was at its worst when it kind of focused more on, success, financial success.
Business results. Yeah. And that's a tension. I think it's a good tension that a lot of companies get into. And it's almost like you need a certain amount of customer empathy and success in order to get the business success. But then it's like a product life cycle curve that once you get so big, it's almost like the focus shifts from customer success to business success, and you either recover and realize it or you don't, I guess.
Yeah. But there was a point where, kind of this reckoning where the folks at Intuit said, we've lost our way. We're not focused on that delightful experience, that emotionally connected experience. And it shows in our numbers, and we need to return to that. I think it was like 2007-ish, something like that, when they started to loop back around. So it's fascinating to see, examples of this stuff manifest in different companies in different ways.
Right. Cool. Okay. Yeah. And it's funny because I like to, I was there. I was fortunate. Scott Cook had moved on from CEO, but was still hanging around. He sat like 2 cubes down from me. I got to interact with him. And what the way I like to pitch it is he came from Procter and Gamble. He's a very smart person. But basically those guys have to make you prefer one brand of soap over another, or detergent, like things that are fundamentally commodities. How do you differentiate a commodity? So it thinks a lot about customer insights and research. So that's kind of how I explain some of that early DNA from working with him. But
that's cool.
Yeah. All right, cool. And then last question, and then we can move on to doing some audience questions, was, we haven't talked about your role at Envision. Your title there, VP of Design Education Publication. It's not a typical title. I know a lot of the things that you work on, but maybe you can tell people like how you spend your time, what you focus on, some of the resources you created there.
Yeah. My role at Envision, you're right, it is unique. Envision recognizes that for a lot of companies, they don't totally understand design. And they don't see it the same way that they would think of maybe engineering or sales or marketing. These are well-established pieces of a business that have tooling and processes and so forth associated with them. And if you're starting a business, you think, I've got to have those things right away. Historically, design has been seen as, especially in the software space, like, let's get to that later, or we could add that on later, not as a lever for competitive advantage. And so much of what my team does, the research that we do, the publishing we do, we publish a lot of books on designbetter.com. They're free books about, like, we wrote the first design ops book. We have a new book coming out soon on design engineering, that intersection of design and engineering. We have a podcast, a Design Better podcast. Marty Cagan was on recently. David Kelly, who co-founded IDEO and founded the D School. Seth Godin, lots of other folks. So in a nutshell, we get to see, I had that experience of being inside of a product team and seeing the wins and dysfunctions of what it's like to be inside of a product team, and thinking like, oh, that's only our experience. And now I get to peer across lots and lots of different teams around the world and talk to different folks in different types of organizations and see the patterns. And a lot of what we publish is kind of like the zeitgeist of software, especially from the design perspective, but we also intersect with other disciplines like product and engineering as well.
Great. Cool. That's great. Yeah, no, I think there's a Principles of Product Design ebook that you wrote there. Right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
there's a design leadership handbook. Oh, the other thing, the new design maturity model that Leah Bewley was involved with. She also spoke at our meetup. I'm a big fan of her work. So
yeah, Leah's amazing. She's great.
There's tons of good resources. So I think somebody put it in the chat, designbetter.co. Definitely check out the podcast, the free ebooks. Looks like a lot of great stuff there. Okay, let's transition to letting audience members go here. I let people, so you should be able to unmute yourself. So Ted Chiasen, you had a great question. This was on my mind too, and a couple people have asked this question. So if you wanna, can you unmute? I'll ask you to unmute. And
yeah, hi.
Hey, cool. Why don't you go ahead and welcome, and you can put your video on if you want, if you're comfortable. If you're not, don't worry about it. There you go. Cool.
Yeah,
hey Ted, how are you?
Guys, hey Aaron, thanks a lot. Thanks Dan for hosting this, and thanks Aaron for all the insights. I am a product design manager at Intuit also, so this
cool.
talk's very,
very cool.
Yeah, so I could relate to a lot of the things you said. I think the point of like companies going through these life cycles of like, focusing on delight and then kind of getting big and then like focusing on business. There's always this good tension of, grounding designers into business and then elevating business into like things like designing for emotion. So it's a good tension. But what are some methodologies that you found to help designers bring more awareness of the value of designing for emotion to business stakeholders, so that they could, rather than just focusing on the bottom line? So maybe you could speak to that and your experience and how you can mitigate those things.
I think stories are powerful ways to help people see something beyond their experience. And that's why, I spent a good chunk of time on that last chapter of the book providing examples of venture capitalists who place big bets on companies because of their approach to emotional design. The story like Slack is, everyone knows Slack and is widely loved and seen as a very successful product. That's also a powerful story. Those can be, having some of those stories in your back pocket can be useful. I think that you can dig deeper too, depending on the space. With Intuit, you've got this in the DNA, so that's an easy thing to call to. But if you're in fintech, or if you're in other types of spaces, spend some time looking at what competitors are doing. What's succeeding and what's not. Also connecting, not to beat a dead horse here, but like spending time with customers and understanding a little bit of context of what's going on in their world, to try to think about how you would position that product more appropriately for them. And I think that there are, I think it doing a bit of research. I tried to do the research for you. in the book to make that an easy reference point so you could pull that out and talk about it in a very numeric way. You can also do some things. I think a lot of us have more power in our work than we acknowledge. That we often think, I have to go ask my boss for permission to do this small experiment, add this thing into the product. You might find that a lot of times people don't notice it. And so putting a thing in and making it small and maybe tying that to a business metric, specifically that you could watch and measure. That's a good way to change people's minds just on a lot of different topics, not just with emotional design. It's like, how might I make a small bet, test this thing out, measure it, and see what happens? So those are some good starting points.
Yeah, thanks. I could attest to asking for forgiveness than asking for permission sometimes is a better approach. And there's also Microsoft did a really good desirability study that really measures the range of emotional inputs that customers do. So that's for the people in the room to kind of look that up.
I love that. That's great. That's cool.
Cool.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks for your question. So there's a lot of questions around this theme of kind of how do we get buy-in for this. I'm gonna Dean, if you want, I just ask it unmute. You want to jump in and ask your flavor of this question. If you're comfortable turning on your video, you can do that too, or you can.
Sure. Hold on.
There you go. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
Hi. It was a great talk. Thank you. And I myself had worked in enterprise software for many years. Quite frankly, I'm so exhausted. So today felt like a luxury just to talk about emotion. And I remember I had a project when I talked to the founder that I say users are scared, when they embark on a new journey. How do we help them to go through that? And he literally just stared at me for like 10 seconds without saying anything, So I felt when most of our battle really, too extreme, even just to explain what design is, what user experience is, and we fight over resources to develop necessary usability. And how do I even sort of convince them, as Aarron mentioned, they will always say later, let's build MVP, get a functionality there. Mm-hmm. But it will be too late. Something's not there. You already lost the opportunity to attract the right users, right? And I find it hard to measure. So that's where the question's coming about. I felt like it will be so much easier if people just get it. It'll be like, yeah, let's invest some resources on this, so we don't have to sort of try to sneak it in under the radar. So that was a question.
So how to convince the skeptics in your organization? Is that roughly where your question is?
How to convince people are not even aware of it. They don't want to be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that can be really frustrating. It can be really draining. That it feels like people don't have that shared vision of there's more that we can create here other than just like simple functionality. And so to go back to the previous question, I think there are some stories that we can bring up to help people see a different perspective, but also say that there are points where whether it's investing in user research, investing in the time it takes to produce a good product, there are some places that just don't make space for that. And if that is the case, you might find other options. Like what else? Where are the places where I could feel connected to that work, you know, and feel like I have the space to be creative in what I'm doing, which, you know, it's an easy thing to say, but it's a tough thing to execute on. But it's difficult. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people and seen a lot of different scenarios, and there are some places where it's a brick wall and people aren't going to hear it.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I think so.
Are you able to do research with customers at all, or?
Yes, but you know, my last project, we sold the company in 10 months. So you can imagine the pace. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to sneak in things and just do what you have to do. And, you know, we did a lot, quite frankly, and with very limited resource. And we even addressed the emotional issues. We heard feedback from our customers saying, you know, it was so good. This was like a learning for us. It made us feel more confident, you know, but that feedback didn't even get on anybody's mind, the radar, you see what I'm saying? So I sort of agree with you, because I'm really trying to figure out where I should do next, where I should go.
Yeah. So I have tried a number of times in situations like that where I want to kind of convince someone who's thinking very quantitatively about the product and the business success to think qualitatively about what we're creating together. And it can be a difficult thing. I've built decks with quotes and like, hey, this is what the customers actually said. This is really what's going on. Nothing's quite as powerful as actually seeing a human, though.
Yeah.
Because what the pushback I've often heard is like, well, that's one person or that's 5 people. Okay, that's 10 quotes. It's only 10 people. It's not statistically significant. So there's always going to be some pushback from a metrics perspective. But when you see a person that really is frustrated or you see that negative experience, and you might be operating like, let's just make a really usable, nice looking product, which is good. And that's okay. We did live user testing at MailChimp with real customers who would come in, and we had a campus where there was multiple buildings, and we would do the test over here, and we would watch people struggle. And that was engineers, and it was product and design and executives. Like, everybody was invited to this. The way you get everyone to attend is by buying lunch for everyone. And people would leave and they wouldn't even make it back to the other building because they would stand in the parking lot and talk about, okay, that was terrible. It was so painful. So what we did was basically make them feel the pain of our customers. And when they felt that pain, that's when they took action. So that's one of the most powerful things, is actually watching real people use the things that you make.
You're right. We should try that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah. And I think if you can get them to watch firsthand, that's amazing. If you're having trouble, then getting video clips at least, is like a proxy to get, because if it's like a PM says it in the back of the head, like, well, is that what they really said? Is that your interpretation of it? So firsthand data is the best, I think, and live is best, but video.
Yeah. Video is great. Videos is very powerful as well.
And you get the little snippets, right? Nobody has time to watch the whole thing. So cool. All right. Thank you very much for your question. Next up, we have Alan. Alan, I see you're here. If you want to unmute and go ahead and ask Aarron your question, that'd be great.
Thanks, Aarron. That was really powerful and resonating presentation, and awesome. I think really drove home the value of designing for emotions. What I'd like to do is to focus before the design phase and look at where those ideas for the design come from. Just for context, after a career working in a various wide range of roles in product, designer, researcher, product management, engineering, marketing, etc., I now coach teams on moving away from a feature focus and towards understanding customer perception of value, what is important to them. And so in that context, I want to hear from you what you recommend for discovering and gaining insight into those emotional needs of the customers that we're designing for. Rather than making up emotions and guessing at what they are, we start with a reality-based understanding of what our customers' emotional needs are.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate the kind words. I mentioned in my talk Mattermind Studios, kind of went past it very quickly, but they have a whole framework of specific research methodologies and tools. This is all that company focuses on. They focus on designing for emotional experiences. I only found out about them like 2-3 weeks ago. I wish I would have known about them earlier because I think what they've built is really amazing. And so there's a lot of user research that we're familiar with in the product space. They've gone a step further, many steps further, that are specific about understanding different types of emotional situations. That's probably the most complete reference point I could offer. That's a really wonderful one. There's some others out there too, but yeah, that's probably the best.
Cool. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, great. We had a question, but the person has left the chat, so I'll ask on their behalf, which is kind of related, which was basically, enterprise versus consumer. And it's like, hey, the assumption is that B2C companies are going to get this more, and an enterprise, they're more in the dark ages. They're less likely to appreciate this.
Yeah.
Have you found that to be the case? And if so, how can we get more, how can we get the enterprise world to kind of, appreciate this more?
Yeah, it once was the case. I think that, especially heard that with that when the first edition came out. Right. There are a few things that changed. Salesforce is one that Mark Benioff in particular, though he's running a B2B business, he really likes the idea of it feeling very B2C, which I'm sure there's a lot of careful consideration in his thinking there. But in a nutshell, what we've seen over the past decade plus as software is pervasive in our lives is that when we're at home, I use a piece of software. It's easy. I can do stuff really quick. It's light and very function focused. And then I go to work and I use this crappy, obtuse piece of software that feels like it dominates me. And there are so many companies, so many B2B companies that have shown software doesn't have to feel like you're being dominated. So we saw this phenomenon at MailChimp. We called it BYOS, bring your own software. That, I'm organizing a thing for my kids' soccer club, and I'm just going to use this email program, MailChimp, and send this stuff out. And then I go to work and I've got to use this really complicated enterprise, which basically means run the gauntlet and get beat up by this terrible piece of software. And so people just routed around it, paved the cow paths of, that's a crappy piece of software that the CTO bought and is forcing us to use. I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm just going to use something different. And at Envision, we see the same stuff happens as well, where you get little pockets inside of a company where teams will use that software as a little outpost until it finally kind of gels and those accounts combine. Same with Dropbox. There are lots of other products out there that have this B2C approach that makes it a lot more attractive in the B2B space. When you think about like retention and even hiring people, attracting people, it's probably not the first thing on the list that people are looking for. But I'll tell you what is not making your employees have a better day is using a really crappy piece of software. People know the difference between good and bad at this point. So we don't really have, I think any company that is in the enterprise space that thinks about their work as like, well, enterprise, it's got to be complicated. It's got to be painful to be good. They're not going to be as competitive as a company that actually feels like consumer software, because every software is B2C. It's all software has a consumer.
B to H, B to human, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I guess the key takeaway is, while that may have been the case, increasingly enterprise companies are realizing that that's the usability and the delight and the emotional design are important and differentiators, and the bar is rising, basically. Right? So,
Yes, absolutely.
I know I worked with the Box team early on. I know they very much, and I've done a couple of fireside chats with Aarron Levie, very much like, we're going to make this B2C level experience. That can be a big differentiator. So I guess if you're trying to answer the question that was asked, if you're trying to motivate people in your company who don't get it, maybe you can highlight some of those. You could show examples of, look at Box and Dropbox and Salesforce.
Microsoft is actually a really great example right now. Like their software used to be pretty obtuse, pretty difficult to use. In fact, they were kind of like the famous whipping boy on this this topic. And they have turned around so dramatically, and now they're like this inspiration to so many other companies and what they're doing. They have an amazing inclusive design guide, by the way, that is worth checking out. Kat Holmes, I believe, is the primary author of that. So they're a really great example. I think Box is another great example where there was that direct comparison between Box and Dropbox, even their names. And then there was this kind of solidifying of the market where Box went enterprise and Dropbox was more consumer focused. Of course, Dropbox is enterprise as well. So they are in the same space, but Box came a long way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Great. Okay, cool. And then L Ulwick, do you want to ask your question about MVP, the famous double pyramid that everybody loves?
Yeah. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the talk, Alan, and for facilitating for Dan. And it was like, I've been very curious about the pyramids and thinking about, like, while building a lot of MVPs, you cannot make them not functional or functional for, like, partially. Still covering the upper stages and especially the higher ones. How do we do it? Like, how do we cover those aspects without losing the whole thing?
I think, again, it depends on the product that you're working on, but we're just thinking about all the things. What is the consumer experience? There's this principle called the Primacy Effect, which is basically about our first impressions, how it shapes so much of our understanding of what's to come. And when we think about that stuff, if we're designing MVPs that are just like super functional, you've probably seen this cartoon a million times on Twitter where, it's like making a car. Like what's the basic functionality of a car?
The wheel, the motorcycle.
Yeah, it's like if you start to build it out of order, you're headed towards that thing that we know is like, that is a car that's going to take me from point A to point B. But hey, I don't have a steering wheel. There's actually no doors to this thing. So if I start going very fast, I'm going to get like a bird in the face or something. So, thinking about your product of like, how might we de-scope all the things that could happen in this to have basic amount of functionality and a certain amount of reliability, which is not that hard to do these days. And, it's usable and thoughtful in its approach. And it feels like emotionally attractive, engaging, like something. It doesn't have to be over the top. It doesn't have to be like Headspace's brand personality brought into your MVP. That's just not practical. It's just not how software works, right? We still want to move fast. But there are ways that we can be thoughtful about that approach to design. Just as when we think about engineering problems or even, product problems, we de-scope. We can de-scope emotional design too. That's why I started with the moments, like thinking about like, what are the moments that are most critical with this new product that you're creating? Where is it like sink or swim, where you either pull them into the experience and they're excited about it, or they feel this connection where it feels, satisfying, or where it all falls apart. Find that moment, find that space by talking to your customers and spend a little bit of time on that. And it doesn't have to add a ton of time to your process. We can still do those things and go to market very quickly. But keeping in mind that primacy effect, if we bring a bad piece of software to the market, people aren't going to want to use that. They're not going to buy it. They're not going to give you money for that product. If we think carefully about each one of those layers and include that, we increase that likelihood. You know, and in our space, there's always this idea of like, let's go to market, see what people say, and then let's pivot. There's always this like constant pivoting. We could probably pivot less and have less entropy if we just took a moment to think like, what is it we're trying to create, and how can we make a really good version of this thing, a really good version. And there are some companies that like wait for it to bake for a crazy long time. I know Squarespace was an example. I got a demo of Squarespace, like a new version of Squarespace back in like 2009, I think. And by their CEO, and I was just like blown away. That was amazing. It was so cool. It was totally a prototype, wasn't real. And I was like, when is this thing coming out? And I think they took 3 or 4 years to build it and launched it. And when it came out, I was amazed. It's pretty awesome. And it's a very successful company now. I don't think a lot of companies could follow that methodology and be successful. So we can descope, but descope doesn't mean that we're operating on like, you know, the bare bones here. We've got to have enough in the product that it is still attractive to customers.
Maybe putting more value into the red routes that we have also can benefit that.
Putting more value into the red routes?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
The most important routes that users are taking there.
Yeah.
Influence definitely these points, and design more emotional experiences definitely there. Not covering a whole bunch of variety.
Yeah. This is where people move through the most. This is the critical break point, or this is the point where it's like, is there a moment to celebrate, or is there a moment where it's not great? You know, Hipmunk, which just shut down, they had an interesting approach of like using emotional design to differentiate themselves in the product space. I think Wealthsimple is, you know, we saw that example today as another one. So that can be another way that we think about it, is like, how does it help our brand stand out in a crowded market?
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, and I one other thing I would add is, if you're trying to motivate people to do the thin slice, a lot of people call it thin slice, is if that's the culture of the company, they probably have some failures already, and failure can be a big motivator. It's like, hey guys, we tried the last 3 products. You know, if we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, like, why is that? Like, so, you know, that might failure is a big motivator. If to say, let's try, and maybe you pick your battle, you pick a certain pilot product, or, you know, you get it, just try to do a wedge strategy where you try the new approach, say, let's do the full slice on Aarron's pyramid for this new thing that we're doing, and see how it goes. A buy-in strategy. So, cool. All right, next up, I think why don't we do last question here? Is that I think we got a good set of questions here. James, do you want to ask your question? So his question is kind of about internal tools.
Yeah, so hi there. Great talk, Aarron. Thank you very much. I was curious, as someone who's been doing internal tools for like the last year or two, we're focusing on like productivity and it's all internal to a large business. How would you do anything different for sort of productivity tools versus sort of consumer tools?
I don't think I would do things differently. I think that I would still talk to my customer. My customer is my colleagues. And I would get context of how they work and where they suffer. There's a really great book Ryan Rumsey just published on designbetter.com or designbetter.co. We'll get you there too. It's called Business Thinking for Designers. And I know you may not be coming from a design space. Maybe you're coming from a product space. But the frameworks in that book are really great. And it's about like having empathy for your colleagues and thinking about, Yeah, thinking about who we work with, and framing our relationships. And actually, Ryan used to work on internal tools at EA, so he learned a lot from that experience. Even if you're doing stuff inside, your company and it's not public facing, it's still that relationship. One human being is making a thing for another human being to use in hopes of making them more productive, making their work easier. It might be bringing a different set of emotions of just like, I feel social pressure to get a lot of things done. Or outperform, or I want to hit certain marks so I can get that raise or that title change next round. Thinking about all those different contexts can be helpful as you work on that. But I mean, I still think that the ideas are sound. That thinking about that functionality, reliability, usability, making your colleagues super productive, and there's a lot that we can do to either to address the emotions that they bring to the product. With internal tools, they're kind of unique because sometimes we end up using them for just an insane amount of time, so much time. Like if you are answering phones and you're using a piece of software to log all of that stuff, or it's a CRM, people are using those products for so many hours. So in many cases, like what's the stress and the fatigue for that type of product? Those are important things to consider.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James.
I think specifically some of the tools like the customer journey one, like the positive, negative emotions as people are using it, finding those low points, addressing those for your internal people could be super helpful. It's usually the negative, it's the annoyance. If you can get rid of the annoyances internally, then it's kind of, I think it helps. So
yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, James, for your question. Aarron, thanks for doing the Q&A. I just want to once again thank Aarron. Thank you so much, Aarron, before we go into the breakout rooms, for everything. Great talk and great Q&A. Taking time. I know it's late on the East Coast.
Yeah.
So
thanks so much, everybody. I greatly appreciate it. And Dan, thanks so much for having me. That was fun.
No, it was a real pleasure. I'm glad that, again, one of the bright sides of being sheltered in place is we got to do this 6 months earlier than we were planning. So
yeah,
excited. And congrats. Best of luck with the launch of the new book.
Appreciate
hopefully we get some new readers here and people can start applying the great advice from your book. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Have a great night, Aarron. Take care.
Bye.